Enterprise Management 360, your main source for tech news, analysis, podcasts, and videos for the enterprise.
Hello and welcome to this EM360 podcast. My name is Max Kurton, Editor-in-Chief here at EM360 and your host on today's podcast. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the true meaning of going passwordless. And joining us to lend his expertise on the matter is Lakhani, the founder and CEO of IDEE. So welcome, Al, and thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Max. Good to be here. Thank you.
And before we delve into today's topic matter, would you mind giving our listeners a bit of background on yourself?
Of course. I started as a computer scientist back in the day. More than 20 years ago. I went into forensic investigations after I finished my undergrad, and I stayed in that field for almost 20 years, Max. I did crisis management, so I used to run the global forensics and cybersecurity practice at a company called Alvarez & Marsal, which is a New York-based crisis management consulting firm. And I learned a lot during these last 20 years being a forensic investigator, and that actually is what brought me to being so interested in digital identities. And I'll use 5 examples of some very interesting projects that I worked in my forensic investigator time. The first one was the investigation into the Swiss banks for the accounts belonging to the victims of the Holocaust. The second one was the product's liability litigation against the manufacturer of Oxycontin, the famous opioid pain medication drug. Then there was a secret shopper program for one of the largest banks in the U.S. for predatory lending. And then there were the bankruptcies of Lehman Brothers and Washington Mutual. And most recently, I guess before I left, Alvarez & Marsal was reopening the banks in Cyprus after the 10-day historic, banking holiday in 2013. And as different as all of these experiences sound, they all had one fundamental theme that was common across all of them, which was identities. And more importantly, no matter whether you were in a financial services space, you were in healthcare, at every single juncture, what I saw was when the identities were digital, they were fundamentally not trustworthy because somebody could steal, for example, your digital identity, Max, and then they could impersonate you, right? And this is why I started devoting my time to solving this absolutely fascinating problem.
Excellent. And that's what we're going to be delving into today, because as you say, you have those different experiences, but it comes down to that identity at the end of the day. And we're going to be understanding what it really means to be passwordless. And I wanted to start off with the basics here and understand from you, why is passwordless the trend today?
Well, it's rather simple. The bottom line is we are not seeing a decrease in cybercrime. And I believe, and I think a lot of people believe, that the root cause are compromised passwords and PINs. And let me explain. Maybe I can do a little trip down memory lane. In the beginning of the century, the U.S. standards organization called National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, said you must change passwords regularly. Well, they thought that would decrease cybercrime. It didn't. Then, towards the end of the first decade of this century, we said, you know what? We should store passwords with salts. Guess what? Cybercrime increased. Then in the middle of this decade, we said, well, let's use a second factor of authentication. Guess what? Cybercrime increased. So the bottom line is we keep on investing time in protecting the password when the most obvious solution should be that we should get rid of it. And that is why I believe after 2 decades, people have come to the realization that maybe passwords are not only annoying, they are also not secure. I think for years, and I'm sure you're in that group, Max, that you hate, or at least at a minimum are annoyed having to manage passwords, right? And people are like, okay, that's annoying. But I think now slowly but surely people are understanding that, well, maybe beside its annoyance, it is really not secure. And maybe I can use a couple of examples to illustrate that a little bit better. So one of the most well-read data breach investigations report is from Verizon. And it's something that they update every year, and it's something that everybody reads very carefully. And there were two statistics for the 2020 report that were very interesting. 71% of the breaches were financially motivated, and 25% were motivated by espionage, right? So pretty scary stuff. And I'm going to use two examples that happened the last 90 days of two very large companies. One is Twitter. There was the Bitcoin hack. I don't know if you remember that, where Elon Musk, Barack Obama, Bill Gates, their accounts were compromised. Their Twitter accounts were compromised. And I think the message was, if you donate Bitcoins to this address, your Bitcoins will be doubled. And it looked like Barack Obama, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, we're all saying this. So naturally, tons of people did this. And guess what happened? What we found out was that there was a privileged access user at Twitter whose account was compromised. And the hackers used that compromised account as a way to send tweets on behalf of Elon Musk, Barack Obama, and Bill Gates. And that is an excellent example of the 70% of the breaches which are financially motivated, right? What did the hackers have to do? They compromised a privileged user account at Twitter. And they did that by social engineering, stealing the password. The second example I'll use is for Tesla, which also happened in the last 90 days. There was a Russian operative that was caught in a sting operation trying to compromise a Tesla employee in installing malware so that they could record passwords, crack those passwords, and steal IP, intellectual property. And that entire sting operation was discovered it was in the news. The FBI was involved, and they found the Russian operative. So another example, motivated by espionage. And what is the common theme here? If your password is stolen, it's compromised, you have no idea that it's been compromised. And this is why I think fundamentally the world is finally waking up and realizing that maybe passwordless is extremely important.
Couldn't agree more. I think those are two prime examples of how easy passwords can be compromised, because when we look at passwords as a form of protection, there's things we should be doing, but probably 90% of the time people aren't doing what they should to keep those passwords secure, different, unique, that could really be beneficial. So the passwordless conversation is definitely something that needs to be had a lot more. And I wanted to move on to talk about the concrete benefits of going passwordless.
You know, passwordless benefits, the benefits of passwordless authentication are felt differently by the different people in the organization. And we have to think about really what are the benefits to the different stakeholders, right? So, for example, for the CIO, whose job is to really maintain and to rein in the costs. When you think about the amount of time that is lost managing password resets, the cost, the loss in productivity, you name it, is tremendous. Just password resets at an average cost $100 per employee per year. And this is a very conservative estimate. So from a CIO standpoint, it's why are we managing passwords for users? They go on vacation, they come back, they've forgotten the password, now they have to reset it. That entire loss of productivity and the cost of managing that is extremely high. So from a CIO standpoint, it's cost. And obviously CIOs are very much interested in looking at new solutions, emerging trends. So I think this is very interesting for them. From a identity and access management standpoint, it's simple. It's reducing management and overhead. I mean, can you imagine how much effort is put behind password management and administration? How many IAM experts and employees could, if they didn't have to do that, they could focus their efforts on so many other things. And so I think from an IAM standpoint, it's really reducing the overhead. From a chief information security officer or CISO point of view, the benefit is that they can stop worrying about passwords and password-related threats and focus on their many other priorities.
Definitely. And I think that is a very key thing for people to keep in mind, that it's not just a responsibility of one employee. It goes throughout the whole organization. That if any point there's a compromisation, it could affect the business entirely. So having that wherewithal to understand that you play a bigger part and controlling your passwords is important. But if we can negate that risk, then why not take that opportunity?
Exactly.
And Al, I wanted to throw a hypothetical kind of scenario at you here, just to see if there's a way that we can kind of break this down a bit further. So if we said hypothetically, someone has a password manager, so they don't need to remember all of those passwords, and they've got this Google Authenticator for security, isn't that enough?
The short answer is no, because the risk of unauthorized access is not reduced by a passwordless experience. It is reduced by a truly passwordless solution. Let me explain. When you have a password, one big disadvantage is if somebody steals it, you don't know that your password is stolen. Let's take you, for example. If I phished you, Max, you would not know that I know your password. And by the time you realize that your password is compromised, it's already too late. And that is one fundamental problem, that having a password is never resolved. Then comes the second part of it, which is when you have a password, guess what? You need to, let's say the recommended procedure is you should hash it and salt it and store it centrally. Well, guess what? All of those passwords are stored centrally. So when somebody gets access to those centrally stored passwords and they can use, brute force techniques to crack those passwords, once again, you're back to the first problem I mentioned, which is if somebody else has your password, you don't know that they have it. And so the how you achieve passwordless authentication is critical. And when you think about it, the best way to achieve passwordless authentication is to get rid of the password. And there is a very well-established practice for many, many, many years. In fact, this technology was invented in the 1970s by three gentlemen working in the United Kingdom in cryptography. And they developed this technology called public key cryptography, which allows you to decentralize credentials while ensuring that you are sure that the person that is trying to get access to an endpoint is indeed an authentic person without having to have what's called a shared secret, like a password. And that technology is incredibly powerful. In fact, that technology is used every day. For example, when you go to your banking website, you see the little lock on the browser where it says HTTPS. That HTTPS is built on public key cryptography. It has been used trillions, or I like to call it gajillions of times since its inception, and it has yet to be broken. So I think there are great solutions like public key cryptography that can actually help you achieve passwordless. And as I mentioned, passwordless means there are no passwords. That means no password vaulting, no replaying passwords, no copy pasting them. So fundamentally, that is what passwordless is. Now let me talk about the next part, which is the Google Authenticator that you mentioned. Well, guess what happens when you use a Google Authenticator? It gives you a 6-digit code that you have to type somewhere. And if you as a user have no clue that this is a phishing website that you have landed on, you have just entered your password and a 6-digit Google Authenticator code. And that Google Authenticator code is valid for 30 seconds. So now they can use that code to start another parallel session and log into those websites. And by the time you realize that both your password and your 6-digit token has been phished, it's way too late. So truly passwordless means the user should not have to enter any data, because that is the only way to prevent any malware from, collecting your keystrokes, having any phishing websites that capture your passwords and, 6-digit tokens. That is what really, truly passwordless means.
Mm-hmm. And as we know, it only takes a couple of seconds for any kind of breach or issue to arise. So being that vigilant is important, but humans by nature, we can't always rely on them to have that forethought in the head all the time. It'd be great. It would solve a lot of issues, but, people get busy, they get sloppy, mistakes are made. It's just what happens.
Exactly.
So this goal of truly passwordless authentication is so important to get to. And thank you for outlining everything with the Google Authenticator and the password manager, because I think that's something that people rely on too much. So in order to get to this truly passwordless goal that we're talking about today, how would you recommend they navigate this complexity?
That's a great question, because, passwordless authentication is a feature of identity and access management, right? AKA IAM. And IAM is indeed very complex. There are people that specialize in IAM. It's a field of expertise, right? And to really understand how IAM works and how to make it truly safe and secure, what is needed is to think of it as a risk and develop a threat model around that risk. And this is exactly what we did at the UK National Cybersecurity Center earlier this year. We worked with them to develop a threat model to really understand all the threats that are faced every day by users around the world. And we based this threat model on the Center for Internet Security Risk Assessment Method, which is important because it conforms to and extends established risk assessment standards such as ISO IEC 27005, NIST SP 800-30, and Risk IT. And we did a very comprehensive review of these threats. And what we did is we broke identity and access management and the threat model associated with it into 4 categories. Category number 1 was identity proofing. Number 2 was identity provisioning. Number 3 was authentication and access control. And we came up with 52 questions that cover each of these areas. And each question had, for lack of a better term, 3 controls or 3 types of answers. A control that was common, meaning, for example, passwords. That's a common control. Then an intermediate control, which was, for example, using magic links as a way to confirm possession of a mailbox. And then there was a recommended control, which was, for example, in certain cases, especially when you're opening a bank account, video identification, right? And so we use these 3 levels as to say, what level of security do you want to achieve for each of these 52 questions? And then we use this model to assess the IAM threats and compared solutions used by businesses today. And using this systematic approach, we were able to better understand the threats to the systems and the assets. And then we used these threats and recommended safeguards to prevent them. And what we realized is that when you use this systematic approach to look at risk, you can actually reduce the risk of the threats of IAM by 5-fold, which, when you think of it, is pretty significant.
Okay, so if we take that a little bit further then, Al, because I find it interesting how it's broken down into the categories and the questioning. How does it work from a scoring perspective then?
Well, scoring is something we worked very closely on with the various IAM experts at the NCSC. And we came up with the following approach. We said scoring needs to be broken into 3 parts. 1 is a likeliness score. So how likely is something going to happen? And we scored that from 1 to 5. 5 meaning it is happening right now, today, and 1 meaning that it is unlikely to happen. And then we added another component, which was impact to the organization and impact to the user. And let me use an example to illustrate this. When a website is facing credential stuffing attacks, right? The website might, for lack of a better term, ban certain IPs that are attacking them, right? This is specifically focused on individual users. So the impact to the organization is a 2, for example, in the sense the organization is not impacted negatively by it, but the impact to the user is a 4 or a 5, depending on what kind of website it is. And so we are looking at it from a standpoint of how does it impact an organization and how does it impact a user? Because both of these are extremely important in trying to understand the risk score. Because once you determine that, you can then start preventing those risks. And an example of that would be, well, if you were to implement passwordless in this scenario, then when credential stuffing happens, well, guess what? It doesn't happen because there are no passwords to stuff. So it significantly reduces the likeliness score once you implement passwordless on the user side and on the organization side. And so that's how the scores can be, the risk scores can be reduced.
Excellent. I think it's important to distinguish those differentiators as being very important. And I'm very curious about these scores. And I think it's a great way to kind of assign these to businesses. So what can you tell me about the most common scores of the various passwordless solutions?
So if you think of the most common solution that is used in the world today, it is passwords, and you use many times a magic link to reset your password, right? That is the score using this threat model that we developed is 20. And then if you were to go to the next level, which is you say, okay, I'm going to keep the password, but I'm going to add a Google Authenticator token, for example, to achieve password plus second factor authentication, then the score goes down to 15. And let's say then you go to the next level and you say, I am going to enable passwordless MFA, multi-factor authentication, which means you use a phone, receive a push on a phone, you unlock the phone. Then your risk score goes down to 12. And when we focused on the most secure way of doing this, we were able to bring the risk score down to 4, which means you can actually prevent financial impact to your company, negative financial impact to your company, and you can stay out of the headlines, which when you think of it is pretty astounding that is actually achievable and possible today.
Mm-hmm. Very difficult thing to achieve, but always good when you can. So I've got to ask then, what is the most important part of that? IAM can be broken into 3 parts. Identity and access management we think of it in 3 parts. One is registration / onboarding, right? Pretty evident. Then is authentication, something you do every day, all day long. And then there is account management. And authentication is extremely important as users use it every day. It needs to be convenient. It needs to be secure. And I think a lot of products on the market today do a good job of making authentication secure. So kudos to a lot of products. However, where they are weak is in registration and account management. And registration, I believe it's because you have to make sure that the device is trusted. And you have to make sure that you bind the user to the app and then the app to the device. If you don't perform these critical steps by assuring what's called transitive trust, then what ends up happening is a man-in-the-middle attack. And that is what you have to prevent. So registration is an extremely important part. Another extremely important part is account management, and specifically adding trusted devices. So I actually find this part very amusing because many products offer strong authentication or multi-factor authentication, right? But when it comes to adding a device, it's back to single factor. And that just makes me laugh because why are you asking people to do multi-factor when at the end of the day, to add another device, you just need a single factor? It kind of completely destroys the strong authentication security. So, I would say that identity and access management is an extremely important part. It's a part that every company should put a lot of focus on. But I think if you say authentication is the most important part, I would say you need to really, really properly think about registration, onboarding, and account management. Yeah, I think that's a very important takeaway to kind of finish up here. And I wanted to just summarize some of my thoughts as you've been talking here, Al, and then get some final thoughts from you, if that's okay. To kind of summarize, I've taken away 3 takeaways from what you've been speaking about today. And I feel like the first one is user authenticity is such an important step because fundamentally, as you were saying at the beginning, for example, Al, if you know my password, then you can be me without me ever knowing that you have my password. So we really need to take that step forward towards that passwordless goal. The second point I'd say is the risk model. Implementing that SSO with the 2FA, it doesn't necessarily reduce your risk. So the only way to reduce risk is to, use a risk model and apply it to your use cases. And I think the third and most fundamental area is that registration. It's the most important part of any identity solution, not just authentication. Would you say that's kind of the main areas? And do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yes. And I would add one more point, Max. Users are going to make mistakes no matter how much you train them. It could be because they were not 100% focused and a user clicked on the wrong link and got phished. But there are also many, many cases where the user doesn't make any mistakes, but their credentials were nevertheless compromised. For example, a drive-by download where the user visited a legitimate, trusted website that unfortunately contains security flaws, which infects the user's office computer and compromises their credentials. So, our job as cybersecurity professionals is to protect users from themselves. We need to empathize with them, and we need to understand how they think, and we need to anticipate how they will act. And I believe that is a surefire way to prevent unauthorized access.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We'd all be super happy. Al, all I can say is thank you for coming on today's podcast. It's been great speaking to you and for lending your expertise on this matter.
Thank you, Max. It was a pleasure to chat with you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Al. You too. And to our listeners as well, we hope you took a lot away from that conversation. But if you want to know more about the risk model and how they have used it along with their passwordless zero trust authentication product called AuthN, to help organizations reduce their risk of authorized access fivefold, please check out getidee.com. That's GETIDEE.com. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, please head on over to em360tech.com for more great content.